I mean, obviously, the idea of getting the genie back in the bottle, getting the spirit back in the bottle, has to do with harnessing the spirit and making it your friend. You know, if you're going to harness the spirit of God, then it's probably best to know, as Dr. Jung does, and as I claim I do, but I do because I've had the experience, and so I have no need to believe, and I have it very often. For example, and I was talking with my Tibetan Buddhist Lama today about it, and mind you, I'm not a Tibetan Buddhist per se, but I go to a meditation group every week. And part of the reason I do that is because I know that Dr. Jung thought that the Tibetan Buddhists had presented a very interesting parallel to his psychology. And so I'm trying to understand what Dr. Jung was seeing. And what I do see is that almost every week there's a synchronicity between what I'm studying in Jung and what we're talking about in the Buddhist teachings. And so, you know, that's the spirit or something. I don't know what it is. But in any case, and I told Rinpoche today, I said, you know, I don't know why I come to this group every week, because, you know, at my conscious mind level, I really, in many ways, resist it. I don't agree with the way my fellow meditators are addressing the subject, and 5 of them, by the way, are professional psychotherapists, but none of them are Jungian. And so I often get shouted down by these people. I told Rinpoche, I don't know why I come every week, but unconsciously, the spirit moves me to come every week. And when I do, I very often have a synchronicity between what I've been studying in the morning on Jungian Studies and what happens at the meditation group. So it's a very fascinating experience, but that's the spirits too. Thomas says in writing a book also, the spirit pushes. Sure. I read that essay earlier this evening, and when I sit down to write an essay, I have a very, very general idea of what I'm going to write about, but I simply start to write it, and the spirit comes out through my pen. And so that's definitely a part of that experience. It's as though the boy in the story tricked the spirit using some Mercurius Hermes trickster power to get the magic rag. Sure, absolutely. I mean, you have to grasp that spiritual power. And Thomas says, I sat in meditation with Quakers first time this past Sunday. I'll bet that was an interesting experience. I've thought about going to Quaker meeting because both of my parents were brought up in Quaker environments in Philadelphia, and they both attended Friend Central in Philadelphia. So the Quaker spirit was always around my house in some way. You know, I never have been to a Quaker meeting, but I know what transpires in them, and I think it's interesting. So Jerome says, a good intro to symbolism and the psychology alchemy lectures in 1959 given by Marie Louise von Franz, Inner City Books. I'm sure that's very good. Marie Louise was an excellent writer, and I'm most familiar with her because of the Grail legend, which she wrote based on the research work of Emma Jung, but she's really an excellent writer and very clear. Page 101, the water of life flows between opposites, sun and sulfur, consciousness and moon, Mercurius, spirit of unconscious. Absolutely. Okay, going back to this, there's a few fascinating things here. I wanted to cover a couple of other things that are in the summary. First, he's addressing the psychological relationship of the lapis to consciousness. Now, obviously, this is the lapis envisions a material object, and we're in paragraph 287, and this is the quote, and we're talking about the lapis now. This stone is below thee as to obedience, above thee as to dominion, therefore from thee as to knowledge, about thee as to equals. Applied to the self, this would mean the self is subordinate to you, yet on the other hand rules you. It is dependent upon your own efforts and your knowledge, but transcends you and embraces all those who are of like mind. This refers to the collective nature of the self, since the self epitomizes the wholeness of the personality. By definition, wholeness includes the collective unconscious, which, as experience seems to show, is everywhere identical. This is important to think about, this particular paragraph, because it really shows how broad and diverse this concept of the spirit is. And later on in here, we get into the Trinity, and one of the ways of referring to the Trinity is body, soul, and spirit. So, the body is obviously material. Soul, I think at this point in time, Dr. Jung had anima and self conflated with one another. So he was really talking about aspects of both when he talked about soul. And then spirit is the energy and information exchange that goes back and forth between the body and the soul. Let me just read this next paragraph here. Paragraph 288. The encounter of the poor student with the spirit in the bottle portrays the spiritual adventure of a blind and unawakened human being. The same motif underlies the tale of the swineherd who climbed the world tree, and also forms the leitmotif of alchemy. For what it signifies is the individuation process as it prepares itself in the unconscious and gradually enters consciousness. The commonest alchemical symbol for this is the tree, the Arbor Philosophica, which derives from the paradisal tree of knowledge. Here, as in our fairy tale, a demonic serpent, an evil spirit, prods and persuades to knowledge. In view of the biblical precedent, it is not surprising that the spirit Mercurius has, to say the least, a great many connections with the dark side. One of his aspects is the female serpent demon Lilith, or Melusina, who lives in the philosophical tree. At the same time, he not only partakes of the Holy Spirit, but, according to alchemy, is actually identical with it. We have no choice but to accept this shocking paradox. After all, we have learned about the ambivalence of the spirit archetype. Our ambiguous Mercurius simply confirms the rule. In any case, the paradox is no worse than the Creator's whimsical notion of enlivening his peaceful, innocent paradise with the presence of an obviously rather dangerous tree snake accidentally located on the very same tree as the forbidden apples. Now, what I wanted to do here is give you this symbol again. This is the symbol of the spirit Mercurius, and it has some interesting features to it. Of course, this is the caduceus that you find in medicine, in symbols of medicine. And what it's representing, among other things, is Kundalini, which is a Hindu spiritual practice where the chakras are represented by the images in different colors going up the caduceus. And of course you have the two snakes going up. One is the good snake and one is the bad snake. And we should always be thinking about these two snakes and how they're intertwining with one another, because good and bad are relative, and one man's cake is another man's poison type of thing. And so you may get to some point in time that is perfect and find that it's not so good after all. For example, my becoming an attorney. When I was in Vietnam, I was in a hooch for 3 months with 3 attorneys. What they were doing sounded pretty interesting to me. I wasn't an attorney at that time. And so I decided that I should go to law school based on being there. And so that spirit came to me at that time. Basically, the genie in the bottle was presented to me in that hooch, and I let it out enough to sprinkle me with a little lawyer dust, and then I put it back away and let it make me chug along through law school and through 5 years of practicing law. So it had its good features in several ways. I found it a very interesting experience to go to law school. It was financially good because I had a GI Bill and so on, and it was an interesting challenge. But gradually I found, once I started practicing law, that I really detested the practice of law. If I had known a little bit better about personality types before I started, I probably wouldn't have, because as it happened, I already had a job I set up to go to work in the banking community. If I had, I probably would have ended up as one of the 1%ers that I don't think so highly of today. But that's the way the genie works. That's the way the spirit pushes you one way or the other. And so you can't precisely say that this snake is right and this snake is wrong. And so this process pushes you up through the chakras, and I'm not familiar with Kundalini well enough to discuss it in terms of chakras, only to say that this image is called caduceus chakra, and it represents the chakras. So for them's knows, it has that relevance, that symbolic relevance also. And then you find the wings, which in that first part that I had read back at the beginning, Hermes is shod in winged sandals. Those wings, those are Akkadian wings, as one of our subscribers refers to herself. Then finally you get up to the self and get to the point where you flower. That's the spirit of the golden flower. So you have to go through a lot of ins and outs and relativity of good and bad to get to the point where you should be from a spiritual point of view. And this is what happens during a lifetime. So it's a representation of getting you from the material you, where you're just a loaf of protoplasm when you're born, to the point where you reach some sort of spiritual level and enlightenment, I suppose. And you get to the point where you have no need to believe you know. Okay, so I'm just going to read through this next paragraph because it sums up a lot of very important stuff. So So paragraph 289, it must be admitted that the fairy tale and alchemy both show Mercurius in a predominantly unfavorable light, which is all the more striking because his positive aspect relates him only to the Holy Spirit, but in the form of the lapis also to Christ, and as triad even to the Trinity. It looks as if it were precisely these relationships which led the alchemists to put particular stress on the dark and dubious quality of Mercurius, and this militates strongly against the assumption that by their lapis they really meant Christ. If this had been their meaning, why should they have renamed Christ the lapis philosophorum? The lapis is at most a counterpart or analogy of Christ in the physical world. Its symbolism, like that of Mercurius, who constitutes its substance, points psychologically speaking to the self, as also does the symbolic figure of Christ. In comparison with the purity and unity of the Christ symbol, Mercurius lapis is ambiguous, dark, paradoxical, and thoroughly pagan. It therefore represents a part of the psyche which was certainly not molded by Christianity and can on no account be expressed by the symbol Christ. On the contrary, as we have seen, in many ways it points to the devil, who is known at times to disguise himself as an angel of light. The lapis formulates an aspect of the self which stands apart, bound to nature and at odds with the Christian spirit. It represents all those things which have been eliminated from the Christian model, but since they possess living reality, they cannot express themselves otherwise than in dark hermetic symbols. The paradoxical nature of Mercurius reflects an important aspect of the self, the fact, namely, that it is essentially a complexio oppositorum, and indeed can be nothing else if it is to represent any kind of totality. The Mercurius as Deus terrestris has something of that Deus abscondus, hidden God, which is an essential element of the psychological self, and the self cannot be distinguished from a God image except by incontestable and unprovable faith. Although I have stressed that the lapis is symbol embracing the opposites, it should not be thought of as, so to speak, a more complete symbol of the self. That would be decidedly incorrect, for actually it is an image whose form and content are largely determined by the unconscious. For this reason, it is never found in the text in finished and well-defined form. We have to combine all the scattered references to the various arcane substances, to Mercurius, to the transformation process, and the end product. Although the lapis in one aspect or another is almost always the subject discussed, there is no real consensus of opinion in regard to its actual form. Almost every author has his own special allegories, synonyms, and metaphors. This makes it clear that the stone, though indeed an object of general experiment, was to an even greater extent an outcropping of the unconscious, which only sporadically crossed the border of subjectivity and gave rise to the vague general concept of the lapis philosophorum. Now, one other thing that I wanted to mention here is that this story of the boy in the bottle type thing was referred in here at some point in this 60 pages, so I'm not going to go back and find it, but he's referring to the Bible itself, so I'm reading from the New American Bible, but he's referring to Revelation chapter 20, and so this is an analog to the spirit in the bottle. Revelation chapter 20, the 1,000-year reign. 1. Then I saw an angel come down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the abyss and a heavy chain. He seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, which is the devil or Satan, and tied it up for 1,000 years, and threw it into the abyss, which he locked over it and sealed, so that it could no longer lead the nations astray until the 1,000 years are completed. After this, it is to be released for a short time. Now, Dr. Jung did, in other places in Psychology and Alchemy and so on, talk about the emergence of Satan after the first 1,000 years, but then, of course, we had a new 1,000-year cycle. I just mentioned Revelation 12:12 here. So in Revelation 12:12, therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great fury, for he knows he has but a short time. I think that from the Jungian psychologist's point of view, the whole 20th century was a reflection of the fact that this devilish spirit had once again emerged after the second millennium, and it's still with us. And so we all have to think about that and how we get that spirit back in the bottle. I think in the end of the first millennium, the church was pretty much able to do it. But of course, the church's traditional myth sort of ended up with holes in it after the 15th century. And the result was that the spirit spilled out into the horrible 175 million deaths in the 20th century. And it's still happening, and we're still at risk of more happening. It's a big, big issue.